Welcome back. I'm Dr. Luke Maynard. You're watching a Cynehelm podcast, and this is part 2 of Numinous Beings Are We, Dead Hands, Dark Fathers, and the Gothic Materiality of Star Wars. In part 1, we talked about the most obvious Gothic reading of the Star Wars saga as a classic Oedipal story of sons killing fathers. Now I want to take a little closer look at the tropes of classic Gothic literature and consider what other ways we might look at the saga as a Gothic story. Like the best novels of Britain's High Gothic period, the classic works of Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and Horace Walpole, Star Wars sits on a borderland between genres, between realism and romance, between hard science fiction and pure fantasy, whose mutual tensions are responsible for a uniquely Gothic atmosphere called the Numinous. This is a keyword in Gothic studies. In Star Wars, it's established partly through an overarching sense of destiny, and partly through the use of the Force. John Williams helps us out by giving us a very particular theme, which he even calls the Force theme, to mark most of these numinous moments. There it is. These moments are all key breaks from the hard science fiction moments into what we would call space magic, maybe, taking us away from the kind of hard sci-fi popularized in the years running up to Star Wars, back into a high fantasy tradition of a completely different kind. The science fiction boom from which Star Wars departs was in many ways an American phenomenon, driven by writers like Isaac Asimov, Heinlein, Philip K. Dick, Larry Niven, Frank Herbert, Brian Aldiss, and, of course, the golden age of the American sci-fi periodical Amazing Stories. But Star Wars came to occupy and ultimately to colonize, maybe for the first time, a space between the mechanized science fiction of this rising American tradition and the parallel resurgence in Britain of quasi-medieval fantasy sagas, the inheritance not just of the Oxford School, of J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and the other Inklings, but of parallel British fantasists like T.H. White and Michael Moorcock. As Hollywood Productions filmed at Elstree Studios in London, England, the films sit in many different ways at the crossroads of the British and American traditions. The once pejorative label of space opera, a term coined by Wilson Bob Tucker in 1941 to refer to the hacky, grinding, stinking, outworn spaceship yarn, is one of the only genre descriptors suited to a franchise which, like the classic Gothic works, plays at being both romance and novel at the same time. The tension between these manifests in surprisingly subtle ways. Like the British Empire before it, the galactic world of the Star Wars Empire operates on an 18th-century Enlightenment model of civilization and barbarism, with the galactic capital world of Coruscant standing in for London, and backwater outer rim worlds like Tatooine standing in for only the most remote and provincial of colonies. And so among a cast of American and British actors, it's no mistake that characters manifest, and in some cases they even affect, American and British accents in direct proportion to their proximity to the core world, and as a clue to their relationship to it. The Emperor himself, played by Shakespearean stage veteran Ian McDiarmid, sticks very closely to a standardized RP or received pronunciation accent, as does his aristocratic pupil Christopher Lee's Count Dooku, who, despite being born on the outer rim world of Sereno, because I know the diehards are going to watch this, was raised from birth on Coruscant, and C-3PO, despite being built and spending the majority of his time on the Rim, is a droid assembled from core world parts and hardwired for work as a Jeeves-like servant to the aristocrats, again, of the galactic center. Meanwhile on Tatooine, Mark Hamill's Luke Skywalker, raised 18 years in the Outer Rim, carries an American accent bordering on a Kansas drawl that evokes the amber waves not of sand dunes, but of the breadbasket of the American Midwest. Obi-Wan Kenobi, raised like Dooku in Coruscant's Jedi Temple since birth, is characteristically English, like virtually all of the Imperial officers in the trilogy. In all 6 films, in fact. Grand Moff Tarkin, Core World, English. Lando, born on the obscure outer rim world of Socorro, American. So, all the simple accents are consistent, but this is where it gets really interesting. Padme Amidala, the elected queen of outer rim world Naboo, speaks in an American accent, Natalie Portman's native accent, in her private life, but she visibly and fluidly affects a trained but phony British accent anytime she's addressing the Senate, or anytime she performs ceremonial or political duties. Even more interestingly, Anakin Skywalker is raised in the colonies and brought to the Jedi Temple right between the ages of 9 and 10, right at the developmental crux where linguists find that regional, social, and ethnic accents become permanent linguistic fixtures in human children. If you learn a language after that age, you usually learn it with an accent. It's a disruptive time to move a language learner, and as a result, the character of Anakin, voiced with a pure American accent by Jake Lloyd as a child, wrestles ever after that with a characteristically inconsistent accent. It's often ridiculed in Star Wars fandom that Hayden Christensen is unsure whether he's affecting an English accent or not, but in the context of this subtle colonial signifier, his inconsistent accent as an acting choice suddenly makes sense. And if we were brave enough to tread on sacred ground, we could even make the same criticism of Mississippi-born James Earl Jones, whose iconic vocal performance as Darth Vader is also regionally uncertain, trapped within the space of an affected British accent and his Native American one. The incredibly subtle sense of genre and place enforced by these features is a marked departure from the heavy-handed turns of plot and dialogue that likewise suffuse not only Star Wars, but also the Gothic pulp tradition. Like those classic Gothic novels, Star Wars is set, for instance, in a morally ordered universe painted in huge, stylized brushstrokes of black and white. Even among a very short list of characters supposedly burdened with moral ambiguity, basically consisting of Lando Calrissian, the only way they produce a gray character, like, say, Han Solo, is by juxtaposing acts which are obviously immoral or selfish against acts which are obviously moral. It's a small leap from the extreme moral order of the canonical Star Wars films to the idea of didacticism arising from the 18th century women's conduct novel, and carried throughout the Gothic tradition. As something like a masculine conduct novel, because Star Wars is still very masculine-centric, it's uncommonly clear in its politics. It couldn't be more explicitly anti-imperial, but with this comes a variety of political resonances which map onto the text in characteristically Gothic ways. One of these ways, a fairly controversial one, is to treat the film's anti-imperialism as a secularized re-rendering of what was the classic 18th century British Gothic's Whiggish anti-Catholicism. The word religion appears only twice in the saga, both times in Episode 4. Han Solo criticizes Obi-Wan on the matter of hokey religions and ancient weapons, while Admiral Motti likewise calls Darth Vader to account, with predictable results, for his sad devotion to that ancient religion. Literal religion otherwise shows up in only two specific instances. First, C-3PO's reference to the Maker, perhaps Anakin himself, as a sort of deified manufacturer of droids, a curious literalization of William Paley's famous metaphor in natural theology of a great cosmic watchmaker. And second, in C-3PO's uncomfortable veneration as some sort of god by the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi. Otherwise, the Force is the only stand-in for religion in the galaxy. Like the Christianity of Gothic fiction, it's a chief device of the Numinous and the Sublime, and in a nod to Protestant England of the 18th century and its deep investment in anti-Catholic xenophobia, it presents two aspects to its spirituality, one side of which we're asked to recognize as good, holy, and progressive. Here is the simple purity of Pilgrim's Progress or early Calvinism, and one side as an unholy inversion, a regressive and oppressive prisoner of its own iconography and excess. And see, here we have the Protestant English construction of Catholicism. The echoes of the Catholic Church don't start and end with the Papal Emperor's Royal Guard, evoking at once both the red-robed cardinals and the pike-wielding Swiss Guard of the Vatican. They extend to both the Emperor and to Darth Vader, who represent not just the vileness of orthodoxy, but some very specific agents of that orthodoxy drawn right out of Gothic tradition. Both of them are hooded and cloistered monks of a sort, at home in space aboard ships and battle stations like labyrinthine interstellar monasteries. They're the sometimes ruined abbeys of space, these big ships whose unrelenting grayness evokes the stonework of a bygone Gothic age. When we encounter the second Death Star, its half-finished state gives us a visually stunning Gothic skeleton, a parallel to the immense ruined cathedral of Gothic literature, and a monument to the oppressive quasi-Catholic side of the Force, whose outer facade betrays its inner decay from the perspective of 18th century English Gothic. Thus, Luke's Oedipal story takes on Gothic overtones, as it's not just an Oedipal temptation, but a temptation toward a religious conversion, from the light side to the dark, from, for instance, the almost Puritan goodness of impoverished provincial cottagers like Ben Kenobi and Yoda, to the ostentatious architectural wealth, corruption, and hypocrisy of the imperial church. Chris Baldock and Robert Mile, in their essay Gothic Criticism, note not only the anti-Catholicism of English Gothic literature, but also the importance of spatial and temporal remoteness to establishing the genre's uncontinental Protestant skepticism. To the Protestant mind, they write, Italy, Spain, and southern France were as much temporal as geographic realms. Thus, the English tourist, like the one who features in the first pages of Radcliffe's The Italian, could encounter Gothic institutions merely by visiting Catholic countries, traveling in time as well as space. Gothic novels thus thrive on anachronistic emphases, and their narrative effects derive from the clash between modernity and antiquity. For Baldock and Mile, the classic English Gothic novels, Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho and the Italian, Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, Lewis's The Monk, are all defined by a progressive bourgeois futurity which generates tension when it's anachronistically mapped onto a setting of, much like Star Wars, long ago and far, far away, which is the setting of almost all Gothic novels. The same tension occurs in Star Wars as progressive humanity rebels against its collective medieval dark parentage, while futuristic machines, ironically, serve as the oppressive symbols of the medieval past. Princess Leia's adopted surname, Organa, quietly marks her as an organic protagonist. She is the anti-machine, a champion not only for her political rebellion but for all living things. The Death Star's destruction of her home planet of Alderaan transforms her political struggle from an ordinary war with casualties on both sides to a clash between the forces of life and the forces of death. Populated by skeletal stormtroopers who answer to the mechanically undead Darth Vader, the Death Stars are counterbalanced by only two types of planets. On one hand, in the Star Wars saga, there are the Green Garden planets, teeming with natural life, places like Naboo, Yavin 4, Dagobah, Endor, and on the other there are the desolate wasteland planets, Tatooine, Hoth, Geonosis, Mustafar, Jakku in the new film. In classical Gothic terms, these inhospitable, hostile planets are places of the sublime, where life and death are engaged and confronted and in perpetual conflict. So it's no coincidence that so many of the key large-scale battles of Star Wars are staged on these desolate planets. Dagobah, on the other hand, perfects on a planetary scale the proto-Gothic landscape ideals of the picturesque movement, pioneered by 18th-century thinkers and landscape designers like Uvedale Price and William Gilpin. Right down to the mysterious grotto of the cave, right down to the eccentric 18th-century tradition of instilling in the garden an ancient ornamental hermit to offer advice to passers-by. The proto-Gothic hermit in this sense is Yoda, whose early romantic Wordsworthian naturalism contrasts sharply with the mechanized empire, right down to his skin, which is literally green, the color of life. By transforming mechanical futurity into a regressive force of medieval menace against the organic force of greenness, and by allowing the Gothic counterfeit of the undead machine life to stand in for supernatural undeath, Star Wars creates a climate in which Darth Vader becomes not just vampiric, but an advanced cybernetic embodiment of that most essential of Gothic symbols, the symbol that David Cantor calls the dead hand of the past trying to maintain its grip on the living. This is a key concept for understanding a lot of Gothic literature, but especially for understanding Star Wars as a Gothic story, even if you don't count the dozen or so literal dead hands that litter the soundstage by the end of the first 6 movies. In the last part of this talk, we'll look at Vader's hands in particular, return to the subtitle of this talk, Dead Hands and Dark Fathers, and round out my argument for a larger and richer cross-reading of Star Wars in the context of an English Gothic romance.